Hudden and Dudden and Donald O'Neary. This Irish presentation of a very ancient tale, known for centuries among disparate peoples, was collected by Alfred Nutt in the 19th century, and it gives the literal narrative flavour of local phrase and emphasis with no literary polishing. The theme is that of the trickster, Uncle Capriano in Sicily, Cap de Mer in Gascony, Unibos in 11th century Latin, Kibitz or lapwing in Germany, who profits from others' weaknesses. Incidents vary, but some are remarkably consistent in the various countries. The hero sells things to people whose avarice makes them believe that these things are, for instance, gold-giving hides. Hypocrites, like the priest who is a woman's illicit lover in certain variants, are trapped. Magic is performed by extra information concealed from the audience. The tale is found in the earliest European collection of popular tales, Straparola's, published in Venice in 1550, and is reported from Africa, India, and Scandinavia in numerous varieties. An analysis of incidents may show something about the connections of the several versions, but it gives few clues as to how the diffusion may have come about. Some of this information is surprising. The Norse and Italian cognates are unusually close, so are the Icelandic and Indian versions, and the German and some Indian renderings. For some reason, the trickster's career is often initiated by some act of aggression of theft against him. Before this event, he seems to have been an ordinary, innocent and law-abiding person. Commentators have been known to state that this fact proves that the story is a prefiguring of the theory that people may be forced into a life of crime or deception by the actions of others. Whether this delinquency, however occasioned, is likely to end, as these tales do, with the complete victory of the trickster, is another matter. Once upon a time there were two farmers, and their names were Hudden and Dudden. They had poultry in their yards, sheep on the uplands, and scores of cattle in the meadowland alongside the river. But for all that, they were not happy. For just between their two farms there lived a poor man by the name of Donald O'Neary. He had a hovel over his head and a strip of grass that was barely enough to keep his one cow, Daisy, from starving. And though she did her best, it was but seldom that Donald got a drink of milk or a roll of butter from Daisy. You would think that there was little here to make Hudden and Dudden jealous, but so it is. The more one has, the more one wants, and Donald's neighbours lay awake of nights, scheming how they might get hold of his little strip of grassland. Daisy, poor thing, they never thought of. She was just a bag of bones. One day Hudden met Dudden, and they were soon grumbling as usual, all to the tune of, "If we could only get that vagabond Donald O'Neary out of the country." "Let's kill Daisy," said Hudden at last. "If that doesn't make him clear out, nothing will." No sooner said than agreed, and it wasn't dark before Hudden and Dudden crept up to the little shed where lay poor Daisy trying her best to chew the cud, though she hadn't had as much grass in the day as would cover your hand. And when Donald came to see if Daisy was all snug for the night, the poor beast had only time to lick his hand once before she died. Well, Donald was a shrewd fellow, and downhearted though he was, began to think if he could get any good out of Daisy's death. He thought and he thought, and the next day you could have seen him trudging off early to the fair, Daisy's hide over his shoulder, every penny he had jingling in his pockets. Just before he got to the fair, he made several slits in the hide and put a penny in each slit. Then he walked into the best inn of the town as bold as if it belonged to him, and, hanging the hide up on a nail in the wall, sat down. "Some of your best whiskey," said he to the landlord. But the landlord didn't like his looks. "Is it fearing I won't pay you, you are?" said Donald. "Why, I have a hide here that gives me all the money I want." and with that he hit it a whack with his stick, and out hopped a penny. The landlord opened his eyes, as you may fancy. "What'll you take for that hide?" "It's not for sale, my good man." "Will you take a gold piece?" "It's not for sale, I tell you. Hasn't it kept me and mine for years?" And with that Donald hit the hide another whack, and out jumped a second penny. Well, the long and short of it was that Donald let the hide go for a pile of gold, and that very evening who but he should walk up to Hudden's door. "Good evening, Hudden. Will you lend me your best pair of scales?" Hudden stared, and Hudden scratched his head, but he lent the scales. When Donald was safe at home, he pulled out his pocketful of bright gold and began to weigh each piece in the scales. But Hudden had put a lump of butter at the bottom, and so the last piece of gold stuck fast to the scales when he took them back to Hudden. If Hudden had stared before, he stared 10 times more now, and no sooner was Donald's back turned than he was off as hard as he could pelt to Dudden's. "Good evening, Dudden. That vagabond, bad luck to him." "You mean Donald O'Neary?" "And who else should I mean? He's back here weighing out sackfuls of gold." "How do you know that?" "Here are my scales that he borrowed, and here's a gold piece still sticking to them." Off they went together, and they came to Donald's door. Donald had finished making the last pile of 10 gold pieces, and he couldn't finish because a piece had stuck to the scales. In they walked without an "if you please" or "by your leave." "Well, I never," was all they could say. "Good evening, Hudden. Good evening, Dudden. Ah, you thought you had played me a fine trick, but you never did me a better turn in all your lives. When I found poor Daisy dead, I thought to myself, well, her hide may fetch something, and it did. Hides are worth their weight in gold in the market just now." Hudden nudged Dudden, and Dudden winked at Hudden. "Good evening, Donald O'Neary." "Good evening, kind friends." The next day there wasn't a cow or a calf that belonged to Hudden or Dudden, but our hide was going to the fair in Hudden's biggest cart, drawn by Dudden's strongest pair of horses. When they came to the fair, each one took a hide over his arm, and there they were walking through the fair, bawling out at the top of their voices, "Hides to sell! Hides to sell!" Out came the tanner. "How much for your hides, my good men?" "Oh, their weight in gold." "It's early in the day to come out of the tavern." That was all the tanner said, and back he went to his yard. "Hides to sell! Fine fresh hides to sell!" Out came the cobbler. "How much for your hides, my men?" "Their weight in gold." "Is it making game of me you are? Take that for your pains." And the cobbler dealt Hudden a blow that made him stagger. Up the people came running from one end of the fair to the other. "What's the matter? What's the matter?" cried they. "Here are a couple of vagabonds selling hides at their weight in gold," said the cobbler. "Hold 'em fast! Hold 'em fast!" bawled the innkeeper, who was the last to come up, he was so fat. "I'll wager it's one of the rogues who tricked me out of 30 gold pieces yesterday for a wretched hide." It was more kicks than halfpence that Hudden and Dudden got before they were well on their way home again, and they didn't run the slower because all the dogs of the town were at their heels. Well, as you may fancy, if they loved Donald little before, they loved him less now. "Oh, what's the matter, friends?" said he as he saw them tearing along, their hats knocked in and their coats torn off and their faces black and blue. "Is it fighting you've been? Or mayhap you met the police, ill luck to them?" "We'll police you, you vagabond. It's mighty smart you thought yourself to be, deluding us with your lying tales." "Who deluded you? Didn't you see the gold with your own 2 eyes? but it was no use talking. Pay for it he must, and should. There was a meal sack handy, and into it Hudden and Dudden popped Donald O'Neary, tied him up tight, ran a pole through the knot, and off they started for the brown lake of the bog, each with a pole end on his shoulder, and Donald O'Neary between. But the brown lake was far, the road was dusty, Hudden and Dudden were sore and weary, and they were parched with thirst. There was an inn by the roadside. "Let's go in," said Hudden. "I'm dead beat. It's heavy he is for the little he had to eat." If Hudden was willing, so was Dudden. As for Donald, you may be sure his leave wasn't asked, but he was dumped down at the inn door for all the world as if he had been a sack of potatoes.
"Sit still, you vagabond," said Dudden. "If we don't mind waiting, you needn't."
Donald held his peace, but after a while he heard the glasses clink, and Hudden singing away at the top of his voice. "I won't have her, I tell you, I won't have her," said Donald, but nobody heeded what he said. "I won't have her, I tell you, I won't have her," said Donald, and this time he said it louder, and nobody heeded what he said. "I won't have her, I tell you, I won't have her," said Donald, and this time he said it as loud as he could. "And who won't you have, may I be so bold as to ask?" said a farmer, who had just come up with a drove of cattle and was turning in for a glass. "It's the king's daughter. They're bothering the life out of me to marry her." "Oh, you're the lucky fellow. I'd give something to be in your shoes." "Do you see that now? Wouldn't it be a fine thing for a farmer to be marrying a princess, all dressed in gold and jewels?" "Jewels, do you say? Ah, now, couldn't you take me with you?" "Well, you're an honest fellow, and as I don't care for the king's daughter, though she's as beautiful as the day and is covered in jewels from top to toe, you shall have her. Just undo the cord and let me out." They tied me up tight, as they knew I'd run away from her. Out crawled Donald, in crept the farmer. "Now lie still, and don't mind the shaking, it's only rumbling over the palace steps you'll be. And maybe they'll abuse you for a vagabond who won't have the king's daughter, but you needn't mind that. Ah, it's a deal I'm giving up for you, sure as it is that I don't care for the princess." "Oh, take my cattle in exchange," said the farmer, and you may guess it wasn't long before Donald was at their tails driving them homewards. Out came Hudden and Dudden, and the one took one end of the pole and the other the other. "I'm thinking he's heavier," said Hudden.
"Oh, never mind,"
said Dudden.
"It's only a step now to the brown lake."
"I'll have her now! I'll have her now!" bawled the farmer from inside the sack. "By my faith, and you shall, though," said Hudden, and he laid his stick across the sack. "I'll have her! I'll have her!" bawled the farmer louder than ever.
"Well, here you are,"
said Dudden, for they were now come to the brown lake, and, unslinging the sack, they pitched it plump into the lake. "You'll not be playing your tricks on us any longer," said Hudden.
"True for you,"
said Dudden.
"Ah, Donald, my boy, it was an ill day for you when you borrowed my scales."
Off they went with a light step and an easy heart, but when they were near home, who should they see but Donald O'Neary, and all around him the cows were grazing, and the calves were kicking up their heels and butting their heads together.
"Is it you, Donald?" said Dudden. "Faith, you've been quicker than we have."
"True for you, Dudden, and let me thank you kindly. The turn was good if the will was ill. You have heard, like me, that the brown lake leads to the land of promise. I always put it down as lies, but it is just as true as my word. Look at the cattle." Hudden stared, and Dudden gaped, but they couldn't get over the cattle. Fine, fat cattle they were, too. "It's only the worst I could bring up with me," said Donald O'Neary. "The others were so fat there was no driving them. Faith, too, it's little wonder they didn't care to leave, with grass as far as you could see, and sweet and juicy as fresh butter.
Ah, now, Donald, we haven't always been friends, said Dudden. But as I was just saying, you were ever a decent lad, and you'll show us the way, won't you?
I don't see that I'm called upon to do that. There is a power more cattle down there. Why shouldn't I have them all to myself?
Faith, they may well say, the richer you get, the harder the heart. You were always a neighbourly lad, Donald. You wouldn't wish to keep all the luck to yourself.
True for you, Hudden, though 'tis a bad example you set me. But I'll not be thinking of old times. There is plenty for all there, so come along with me. Off they trudged with a light heart and an eager step. When they came to Brown Lake, the sky was full of little white clouds, and if the sky was full, the lake was just as full. "Ah, now look, there they are!" cried Donald, as he pointed to the clouds in the lake.
"Where? Where?" cried Hudden, and "Don't be greedy," cried Dudden,
as he jumped his hardest to be up first with the fat cattle. But if he jumped first, Hudden wasn't long behind. They never came back. Maybe they got too fat, like the cattle. As for Donald O'Neary, he had cattle and sheep all his days, to his heart's content. Riquet with the Tuft. The earliest collection of popular tales in relatively modern times is the Piacevoli Noti of Straparola, published in Venice in 1550. Some 3,000 years after the Egyptians were recording some of their own legends. The book was banned in 1606 and placed on the Vatican Index, as 2 centuries later the Grimm's work was banned in Vienna for encouraging superstition. Apart from often ignoring the question of a sound moral, the traditional story's superstitious content may have included deeper implications. The Riquet tale, transmitted by Charles Perrault in the 18th century, could be taken as suggesting that humanity, within its often somewhat ugly outer husk, has a potential for transformation and inner beauty. Beauty and the Beast has been characterized, for similar reasons, as a Buddhist-inspired tract, though the transformation or development theme is far from being a Buddhist monopoly. Riquet with the Tuft is one of the first 8 tales in the book, which includes Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, Bluebeard, Puss in Boots, and Cinderella. These Mother Goose's tales, issued in 1697 and translated 32 years later into English, are thought to have hit the British Isles with such force as to knock out most of the ancient English stories, which thereafter became difficult to locate. Written for the French court and dedicated to the niece of King Louis XIV, the stories are certainly romanticized from what one would expect from the lips of country folk reciters, but yet they have a far greater flavor of recitation than the stories of other collectors. Altogether, this specimen gives an excellent example of how Perrault handled his themes. Once upon a time there was a queen, who brought into the world a son so ugly and so ill-shaped that it was for a long time doubtful if he possessed a human form. A fairy, who was present at his birth, affirmed that he would not fail to be amiable, as he would have much good sense. She added that he would be able, because of the gift with which she had endowed him, to impart equal intelligence to the person he should love best. All this consoled the poor queen a little, who was much distressed at having brought into the world so hideous a little monkey. It is true that the child was no sooner able to speak than he said 1,000 pretty things, and that there was in all his actions an indescribable air of intelligence which charmed one. I had forgotten to say that he was born with a little tuft of hair on his head, which caused him to be named Riquet with the Tuft, for Riquet was the family name. At the end of 7 or 8 years, the queen of a neighbouring kingdom gave birth to 2 daughters. The first that came into the world was fairer than day. The queen was so delighted that it was feared her great joy would prove hurtful to her. The same fairy who had assisted at the birth of little Riquet with the Tuft was present upon this occasion, and to moderate joy of the queen, she declared to her that this little princess would have no mental capacity, and that she would be as stupid as she was beautiful. This mortified the queen exceedingly, but a few minutes afterwards she experienced a very much greater annoyance, for the second girl to which she gave birth proved to be extremely ugly. "Do not distress yourself so much, madam," said the fairy to her. "Your daughter will find compensation. She will have so much sense that her lack of beauty will scarcely be perceived." "Heaven send it may be so," replied the queen. "But are there no means of giving a little sense to the elder, who is so lovely?" "I can do nothing for her, madam, in the way of wit," said the fairy, "but everything in that of beauty, and as there is nothing in my power that I would not do to gratify you, I will endow her with the ability to make beautiful the person who shall please her." As these 2 princesses grew up, their endowments increased in the same proportion, and nothing was talked of anywhere but the beauty of the eldest and the intelligence of the youngest. It is true that their defects also greatly increased with their years. The younger became uglier every instant, and the elder more stupid every day. She either made no answer when spoken to, or she said something foolish. With this she was so awkward that she could not place 4 pieces of china on a mantel shelf without breaking one of them, nor drink a glass of water without spilling half of it on her dress. Notwithstanding the great advantage of beauty to a girl, the younger bore away the palm from her sister nearly always in every society. At first they gathered round the handsomer to gaze at and admire her, but they soon left her for the wittier, to listen to 1,000 agreeable things, and people were astonished to find that, in less than a quarter of an hour, the elder had not a soul near her, and that all the company had formed a circle round the younger. The former, though very stupid, noticed this, and would have given, without regret, all her beauty for half the sense of her sister. The queen, discreet as she was, could not help reproaching her frequently with her folly, which made the poor princess ready to die of grief. One day, when she had withdrawn into a wood to bewail her misfortune, she saw a little man approach her, of most disagreeable appearance, but dressed very magnificently. It was the young Prince Riquet with the Tuft. He had fallen in love with her from seeing her portraits, which were sent all round the world, and had quitted his father's kingdom to have the pleasure of beholding her and speaking to her. Enchanted to meet her thus alone, he accosted her with all the respect and politeness imaginable. Having remarked, after paying the usual compliments, that she was very melancholy, he said to her, "I cannot comprehend, madam, how a person so beautiful as you are can be so sad as you appear, for though I may boast of having seen an infinity of lovely women, I can say that I have never beheld one whose beauty could be compared to yours." "You are pleased to say so, sir," replied the princess, and there she stopped. "Beauty," continued Riquet, "is so great an advantage that it ought to surpass all others. When one possesses it as you do, I do not see anything that could very much distress you." "I would rather," said the princess, "be as ugly as you and have good sense than possess the beauty I do and be as stupid as I am." "There is no greater proof of good sense, madam, than the belief that we have it not. It is the nature of that gift that the more we have, the more we believe we are deficient of it." "I do not know how that may be," said the princess, "but I know well enough that I am very stupid, and that is the cause of the grief which is killing me." "If that is all that afflicts you, madam, I can easily put an end to your sorrow," said Riquet. "And how would you do that?" said the princess. "I have the power, madam," said Riquet with the Tuft, "to give as much wit as any one can possess to the person I love the most, and as you, madam, are that person, it will depend entirely upon yourself whether or not you will have so much wit, provided that you are willing to marry me." The princess was thunderstruck, and replied not a word. "I see," said Riquet with the Tuft, "that this proposal pains you, and I am not surprised at it, but I give you a full year to consider it." The princess had so little sense, and at the same time was so anxious to have a great deal, that she thought the end of the year would never come, so she accepted at once the offer that was made her. She had no sooner promised Riquet with the Tuft that she would marry him that day 12 months ahead, than she felt herself to be quite another person from what she was previously. She found she possessed an incredible facility of saying anything she wished, and of saying it in a shrewd, yet easy and natural manner. She commenced on the instant, and kept up a sprightly conversation with Riquet with the Tuft, during which she chatted away at such a rate that Riquet with the Tuft began to believe he had given her more wit than he had kept for himself. When she returned to the palace, the whole court was puzzled to account for a change so sudden and extraordinary, for in proportion to the number of foolish things they had heard her say formerly, were the sensible and exceedingly clever observations to which she now gave utterance. All the court was in a state of joy which is not to be conceived. The younger sister alone was not very much pleased. No longer possessing over her elder sister the advantage of wit, she now only appeared, by her side, as a very disagreeable-looking person. The king was now led by his elder daughter's advice, and sometimes even held his council in her apartment. The news of this alteration having spread abroad, all the young princes of the neighbouring kingdoms exerted themselves to obtain her affection, and nearly all of them asked her hand in marriage. But she found none of them sufficiently intelligent, and she listened to all of them without engaging herself to anyone. At length arrived a prince so rich, so witty, and so handsome that she could not help feeling an inclination for him. Her father, having perceived it, told her that he left her at perfect liberty to choose a husband for herself, and that she had only to make known her decision. As the more sense we possess, the more difficulty we find in making up the mind positively on such a matter, she requested, after having thanked her father, that he would allow her some time to think of it. She went, by chance, to walk in the same wood where she had met with Riquet with the Tuft, in order to ponder with greater freedom on what she had to do. While she was walking deep in thought, she heard a dull sound beneath her feet, as of many persons running to and fro, and busily occupied. Having listened more attentively, she heard one say, "Bring me that saucepan," another, "Give me that kettle," another, "Put some wood on the fire." At the same moment the ground opened, and she saw beneath her what appeared to be a large kitchen, full of cooks, scullions, and all sorts of servants necessary for the preparation of a magnificent banquet. There came forth a band of from 20 to 30 cooks, who went and established themselves in an avenue of the wood at a very long table, and who, each with a larding pin in hand, set to work, keeping time to a melodious song. The princess, astonished at this sight, inquired for whom they were working. "Madam," replied the most prominent of the troop, "for Prince Riquet with the Tuft, whose marriage will take place tomorrow." The princess, still more surprised than she was before, and suddenly recollecting that it was just a 12-month from the day on which she had promised to marry Prince Riquet with the Tuft, was lost in amazement. The cause of her not having remembered her promise was that when she made it she was a fool, and on receiving her new mind she forgot all her follies. She had not taken 30 steps in continuation of her walk, when Riquet with the Tuft presented himself before her, gaily and magnificently attired, like a prince about to be married. "You see, madam," said he, "I have kept my word punctually, and I doubt not but that you have come hither to keep yours, and to make me, by the gift of your hand, the happiest of men." "I confess to you frankly," replied the princess, "that I have not yet made up my mind on that matter, and that I do not think I shall ever be able to do so to your satisfaction." "You astonish me, madam," said Riquet with the Tuft. "I have no doubt I do," said the princess, "and assuredly, had I to deal with a stupid person, a man without mind, I should feel greatly embarrassed. 'A princess is bound by her word,' he would say to me, 'and you must marry me, as you have promised to do so.' But as the person to whom I speak is the most sensible man in all the world, I am certain he will listen to reason. You know that, when I was no better than a fool, I nevertheless could not resolve to marry you. How can you expect, now that I have the sense which you have given me, and which renders me much more difficult to please than before, that I should take a decision today which I could not do then? If you seriously thought of marrying me, you did very wrongly to take away my stupidity, and enable me to see more clearly than I saw then." "If a man without sense," replied Riquet with the Tuft, "should meet with some indulgence, as you have just intimated, were he to reproach you with your breach of promise, why would you expect, madam, that I should not be equally so in a matter which affects the entire happiness of my life? Is it reasonable that persons of intellect should be in a worse condition than those that have none? Can you assert this, you who have so much and have so earnestly desired to possess it? But let us come to the point, if you please. With the exception of my ugliness, is there anything in me that displeases you? Are you dissatisfied with my birth, my understanding, my temper, or my manners?" "Not in the least," replied the princess. "I admire you in everything you have mentioned." "If so," rejoined Riquet with the Tuft, "I shall be happy, as you have it in your power to make me the most agreeable of men." "How can that be done?" said the princess. "It can be done," said Riquet with the Tuft, "if you love me sufficiently to wish that it should be. And in order, madam, that you should have no doubt about it, know that the same fairy who, on the day I was born, endowed me with the power to give understanding to the person I chose, gave you also the power to render handsome the man you should love, and on whom you wish to bestow that favour." "If such be the fact," said the princess, "I wish with all my heart that you should become the handsomest prince in the world, and I bestow the gift on you to the fullest extent in my power." The princess had no sooner pronounced these words than Riquet with the Tuft appeared to her eyes, of all men in the world, the handsomest, the best made, and most amiable she had ever seen. There are some who assert that it was not the spell of the fairy, but love alone that caused this metamorphosis. They say that the princess, having reflected on the perseverance of her lover, on his prudence, and all the good qualities of his heart and mind, no longer saw the deformity of his body, nor the ugliness of his features, that his hunch appeared to her nothing more than the effect of a man shrugging his shoulders, and that instead of observing, as she had done, that he limped horribly, she saw in him no more than a certain lounging air which charmed her. They say also that his eyes, which squinted, seemed to her only more brilliant from that defect, which passed in her mind from a proof of the intensity of his love, and, in fine, that his great red nose had in it something martial. However this may be, The princess promised on the spot to marry him, provided he obtained the consent of the king, her father. The king, having learnt that his daughter entertained a great regard for Riquet with the Tuft, whom he knew also to be a very clever and wise prince, accepted him with pleasure for a son-in-law. The wedding took place the next morning, as Riquet with the Tuft had foretold, and according to the instructions which he had given some time before, a very great feast was served to hundreds of guests.